Mothtown is set in a Britain that's at once familiar, yet also eerily and disturbingly twisted. Rumours of groups of people missing reach the ears of the young narrator David. The offerings left at the side of the road seem to be somehow connected to this. People communicate in clicks and gestures, and mudmen shamble along the streets. All of these phenomena seem to be related to something that comes to be known as the modern problem. Is there a rational explanation for this? Something as prosaic and sad as loneliness? Or is David being lied to? And are there more mysterious forces at work? Welcome to the world of Mothtown. And welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode, I invite an expert to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm joined by Caroline Hardaker to discuss her second novel, Mothtown. I hope our conversation inspires you to read it, and if you have anything to say about this work of fiction or a conversation, please leave us a comment. And if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Caroline Hardaker is a woman of many talents. She's an author, a poet, a novelist, a librettist, and a sporadic puppeteer. She's had work featured in The Washington Post, The Guardian, and The New Scientist. Her debut poetry collection, Bone Ovation, was published in 2017, and her first full-length collection, Little Quakes Every Day, was published in 2020, and both of those published by Valley Press. Her debut novel was Composite Creatures, and that was shortlisted for a Golden Tentacle Award at the Kitschies. And her second novel, the one we're discussing today, is called Mothtown. It was published by Angry Robot in November 2023. It's a pleasure to welcome Caroline to the show. Hi, Caroline. Thank you so much for joining me on the World Literature Podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So we're talking about your novel, Mothtown. Could you just start by saying a little bit about the novel? Who might like it? Why do you think people should read it?
Sure. So Mothtown was published last November. It is an adult novel classed as literary, but it's one of these genre-bending novels which seems to defy any kind of label. If you go into a bookshop, you'll find it in many different sections. I've seen it in
What's the wildest one then?
Horror, in my mind, horror.
Okay.
Because I never thought of it as a horror at all. The same with the previous novel, Composite Creatures. I think that's been in horror too, but unless it's the horror of reality, I don't see it as horror at all.
Right.
But it's also been in science fiction, fantasy. It's not yet in autobiography, thank goodness, because it's nowhere near. But yes, so it's it's a little bit genre bending. It does contain illustrations. I think there's 6 by Chris Riddell.
They're beautiful, by the way, really. Yeah.
I know they do add to it. Like I'm a big advocate for any kind of artful depictions inside of novels. I don't think enough adult novels have illustrations within them, because I just think even if there's just a few, just to see an artist rendering of whatever's happening inside means so much. But generally, in a nutshell, the nature of the novel is quite spoilery. Since a lot of the stuff I write does tend to have reveals throughout, but I'll try my best to describe it. It follows a man called David, and he is telling his story from an adult perspective about his youth. The novel is split into 2 sections. On one half, he's telling the story of from when he's about 6 or 7, I think. And the event of his grandfather dying occurs, who is his main connection to the world. His grandfather is his world. And then the other half of the novel is a man running through a landscape which is known as Mothtown, which is the title of the book. And this is a very rural, forested, a bit surreal, dare I say, landscape
Mm.
in Scotland.
Mm.
And this is a man who is being pursued by something he doesn't quite understand, and he is searching for a door. And essentially, the novel is about how those two stories entwine, interlink, and what they really mean, and whether the way David is telling you about these things is accurate.
Mm.
But there's touches of the multiverse in there. There's a lot
Mm.
of explorations of grief, communication, a lot of mental health.
Mm.
And generally, people have found it quite disturbing
Yes.
in a light-hearted way.
We'll come
um,
back to some of those themes. Yeah, sorry, carry on. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's a difficult novel to describe without
Mm.
giving too much away. But I'll try my best as we answer the questions to not spoil any of the
Okay.
twists.
Minor spoilers are okay, I think. And yeah. Um,
And it's
and actually,
unavoidable, I think.
yeah, yeah. Um, and actually, just before we move on, I wanted to ask about the pictures because we had a conversation about children's literature quite recently, a Chinese children's novel, and talked with Jessica Medhurst, who was the interview about the pictures, and she said some very interesting things. So, how did they come about? Was it something you asked for, or did the publisher recommend
No, it wasn't actually. I mean, in retrospect, I would have asked if I'd known it was a very possible thing.
it? Mm.
But I've collaborated with Chris for how long? Maybe 3 or 4 years. I think it's 4 years now. And we got in touch mainly because I was mainly a poet before I started writing novels.
Hmm.
And as well as having a couple of collections, I had a lot of pieces in anthologies. And
Mm.
Chris has a lot of work to do with poetry. He loves poetry.
Mm.
I think I heard him say the other day that he's never met a poet that he hasn't loved. So he was doing illustrations for a Macmillan anthology um, about women, and I had a piece in there, and he was putting it on social media, the poems that he'd chosen to illustrate just freehand in the book, and one of them was mine. And then we
Mm.
got to talking, and he offered to live illustrate the launch for my first novel, which was Composite Creatures, and he
Right.
did.
Okay.
So he was projected on the board, and he did this for Mothtown too.
Mm.
And he basically just free illustrated the conversation, scenes from the
Right.
novel. Um, and it was incredible. And since then, we've worked on a few different projects. And when it came to writing Mothtown, he was very keen to read it. And when he
Mm.
wrote it, it was his idea to do some key illustrations for
Mm.
the book, but I just jumped at the chance because it was
Mm.
such a wonderful idea. And I
Yeah.
was so keen to see the characters and certain situations in the book come through someone else's perception. Because one of the key elements of Mothtown and what I love about fiction is, particularly when it's through the first person perspective, the filter that we are telling the
Mm.
story through. So we are reading a description, say, of there's characters in the book called which David refers to as mudmen,
Mm.
who essentially look like homeless people. They're normally clad in brown overcoat layers, and they're trudging down the street where he lives. It's a route for them. And he describes them very much like these mudmen, these otherworldly
Mm.
people who have a purpose and they're striding towards something. But the person across the street might just see this as somebody in their overcoat, their trench coat,
Mm.
like coming back from work. And it was just a fascinating process to see an external reader, in this case, Chris,
Mm.
creating an image of that, which would also help the reader interpret the language.
Mm.
I don't know whether it works for every particular novel, but particularly first person, I find it fascinating. And a lot of the
Mm.
stuff in the book is quite metaphorical, I guess. So the
Yeah.
illustrations in the book, particularly towards the end, become less literal, I'll say.
Mm.
It brought it to life. And I'm always been a fan of book plates in novels. I don't
Yeah.
know why we don't do it more. It's such a wonderful opportunity.
It makes it
Anyway, I
just
hope I
such
can
a
do it more.
it just makes it such a nice like artifact. I mean, in the age of digital I read a lot, for example, on e-readers, but still to have a paper
Yes.
book is a pleasure, and one with images in just feels, yeah, you have this wonderful object. So yeah, they certainly add to it.
Yeah, they
So
do.
mm,
I want more people, and I'm very much into reading graphic novels as
mm,
well because I think not in the case of Mothtown so much, but I think there is a general art form in how words are even laid on the page. And I used to
mm,
explore this quite a lot in the poetry side of it too,
mm,
in terms of white space and how drawings interact with text in order to make you feel and experience different things when you read the words.
mm,
There's so much to delve into there. And
yeah.
one day I'd like to kind of look at that in more of a novel format. But yeah, that's the next one to do, I guess.
I'm glad you mentioned white space and tell my students how to read. Yeah, everybody uses digital, like read on a tablet or a laptop screen. Please not on your phone because it's squashed up little. Somehow
Oh,
the
it's awful.
space. Yeah, yeah,
I know it's terrible.
yeah.
I mean, to be honest, on the go, I've had to try and do it before if I've had to read something for a blurb or a review, and it ruins the experience
Mm,
entirely. And it is so not what how you're meant to get the words into your head. Like
mm,
how you see the words affects how you process the words. White
mm,
space and spacing is so important.
yeah.
So yeah, no mobile reading if possible.
Okay, let's get onto the novel itself. So it's a novel that I felt at least combines quite a lot of big themes that resonate in the modern world. And in fact, there are these disappearances that are referred to as the modern problem. You've got sort of conspiracy theories, gaslighting, loneliness, alienation, these really fraught relationships between parents and children. Um, would you say any of those was really like the kernel, the central idea of the novel? I guess either in terms of the process of your writing or the central theme, or was it just a sort of mixture that came together as you
Yeah.
wrote?
Um, there is one central theme, but I would say everything that you've mentioned links with it. So,
Mm,
I mean, it's probably relevant to say that I started writing the novel pre-COVID,
mm,
pre-lockdown, just. So
mm,
I'd had the novel planned, I had started drafting, and then 2020 came and COVID hit. Um, And that probably did have a bit of an impact on the novel
mm,
too. The novel was originally, in my head, in its purest form, an exploration of communication.
mm,
So either forms of communication that we share, whether it's spoken words, body language, imagined conversation,
mm,
and the consequences of an inability to communicate
mm,
via any of those ways.
mm,
So whether people can't really struggle to talk about how they are, or whether people can't interpret body language very easily, and the
mm,
isolation and segregation that comes as a consequence of that. Partly writing the novel during lockdown and COVID did at the time I didn't really think that it had an impact because the
mm,
novel was already about that, but I'm sure it did because
mm,
everywhere I looked and everywhere we all looked, we could see people becoming isolated
mm.
and struggling to communicate.
Yeah.
We had Zoom
Mm,
quizzes, we
yeah.
had conversations on the phone, where you could see people roughly out the window a little bit, but we lacked human touch.
Mm,
We lacked the interpretation of an in-person get together where you're interpreting just this slight movement
yeah.
of people without them saying anything. And all of that has an impact in how you portray yourself and how you portray yourself as well. And so that for me was at the core of the novel because David is a character who struggles with all of those things.
Mm,
The only person in his whole life who he has felt gets him is his grandfather.
mm,
Um, Everyone else in his family just doesn't understand what he's doing, doesn't understand what he's saying. They misinterpret things that he does. They describe him, and he begins to describe himself as this inhuman thing. He always uses
mm,
insects to talk about the way he moves. I think there's a
mm,
bit very near the beginning, probably 2 pages in or something, where he talks about scaling the stairs like a spider or crawling on the floor like a beetle.
mm,
And his family think of this as a negative trait, and
Mm.
they say, David, you're a liability, you're a hazard.
Mm.
Whereas his granddad turns it into an affectation. He
Mm.
calls him Bumblebee, and
Mm.
they have this very strong connection.
Yeah.
And then once his granddad dies very early in the novel, so I don't think that's too spoilery.
Mm.
That is his whole world gone, and his
Mm.
whole sense of self in a way, because he channeled that through his grandfather.
Yeah.
Um, and in a sense, his whole family is dealing with grief and can't communicate, just
Mm.
like David. His dad kind of recedes into himself. His mother deals with that and the strange events of the world, which is on the news, which we might touch on later,
Yeah.
in increasingly erratic ways. And David can't connect to those people at all. The only person he marvels at is his sister Emily, who's a few years older, and
Mm.
he describes her as being chameleonic in terms of her ability to alter her speech for different people. She's only a
Mm.
child, but she can
Mm.
fit into different situations. She can change her speech pattern. She fits in
Mm.
wherever she goes. She is this light. And he just does not understand how that works.
Mm.
It's like a different language to him. And even when it comes to his granddad, he has his own little language that they speak, which is, again, it's quite insectoid, I guess, because it's
Mm.
full of little clicks and sounds, but
Yeah.
he enjoys it. So from the communication core, it
Mm.
then spiraled out to be
Mm.
about isolation and loneliness.
Mm.
And the modern problem that you mentioned is almost like a societal rendering of some of these things. And the
Mm.
question is whether the modern problem is causing isolation and dislocation. It's the isolation and dislocation that is causing this modern problem. So there's a lot to it, I guess, but
Mm.
we're human beings, so we are complicated, and all of these things do interlink with each other.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge advocate for how important communication is and
Mm.
openness.
Mm.
Yeah, without that, it all spirals terribly out of control.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's funny you mentioned COVID and just the non, I think we often think of communications, the words we're saying, the language. I just remember how exhausting it was doing everything by Zoom because you didn't have gesture,
Mm-hmm.
the physicality, you couldn't just read those things. It just felt, yeah, I'm coming out of
Yeah,
days of
it
doing sort
it
of online
demanded
teaching.
a sort of
Yeah.
extrovert level of of communication and
Mm.
presentation. You didn't just have a soft conversation. Everything had to become a presentation. And
Mm.
there's quite a lot in the novel, I guess, which looks at masks, the masks we wear.
Mm.
So, like Emily, her chameleonic ability to wear masks and change her masks and
Yeah.
it appearing flawless to David. He can't do that at all. And I think during COVID, when we were Zooming and FaceTiming,
Mm.
we had to switch these masks all the time, and you
Yeah.
became a different person because you were through a digital medium. It was
Yeah.
really hard work. I
It
think everyone
was.
was exhausted.
Yeah.
It was quite strange to get with people again at the end as a person and
Yeah.
discover who you were. It was a strange feeling. Yeah.
Certainly was. Yeah. And I mean, you talked just now about David's relationship with his grandfather, and it led me to thinking whether you had a particular age group in mind when you were writing it. And actually, talked about it's appeared in all these different areas of bookshops. And there are sections where he is much younger, and
Mm-hmm.
in those sections, I felt like maybe young people who feel they're struggling to fit in, haven't quite found their
Mm-hmm.
identity. People like that might really identify with those. So I was almost thinking that you could see, now what's now called
Mm-hmm.
young adult, it would sort of fit with that. On the other hand, there's sections that felt really dark and adult. So I was wondering if you
Yeah.
had given thought to the audience particularly. Did you target a particular group, or was this just the novel
Yes.
that came?
Yeah, in a way, it's just the novel. It's the
Mm.
novel that I wrote. I
Mm.
do write for adult audiences,
Mm.
and there's a huge sort of tradition of, I guess, a lot of literary novels telling the story retrospectively of a childhood through an
Yeah.
adult lens.
Mm.
And I'm very interested in lenses as a
mm,
way of telling stories
mm,
and telling lies and
mm,
inconsistent narrators, unreliable narrators. Even when people intend to tell the complete truth, the
mm,
filter that you see the world through. So in the case of Mothtown, I think for about half, the first half of the first half of the first half of the novel, he is
mm,
quite young.
mm,
He's a child, and then the second half, he's in his late 20s. And the childhood bit is it's not written in a very childlike way, I guess. Even
mm.
then, it's David remembering his past. So
Yeah.
the strange ways that his alienness comes out is up to the reader to decide at that point whether they
Mm,
think it's literal or not.
yeah.
I guess I've never read a review by a young person who's read it.
Mm,
I don't know whether they would enjoy it.
mm,
I'm not sure whether some of the themes might go over their heads, but there might be aspects of it that they would enjoy. Um, Young readers, in my experience, from the different projects I've been involved with, do very much like darkness, so they might
mm.
like the
Yeah.
dark elements of it.
Yeah.
And you don't need to pick up on all the themes to enjoy a novel. But I
True.
guess when I wrote it for an adult audience.
Mm,
I think what makes my novels a bit complicated in terms of categorizing is the genre bending quality to them.
mm,
And when it comes to the ins and outs of the book industry, that makes it more difficult to talk about them to a degree because even
mm.
for a publisher, they have to decide very early on what sort of audience they are trying to sell your book to.
Yeah.
In a very matter of fact way. Are they trying to sell it to genre readers or are they trying to sell it to literary readers?
Mm,
And if you get that slightly wrong, then the outcome for the book is very, very different.
mm.
So it's quite difficult when books bend. But a lot of my favorites and my recommendations later as well are for other kind of genre bending books, which are literary at the heart, but I guess they twist it in different ways. I like a bit of surreal quality to text.
Okay. Oh,
So
looking
yeah.
forward to those recommendations then. And I suppose, yeah, as a follow-up question then, I mean, I think one of the issues that the book raises is what age we're ready to confront unpleasantness, fear, horror. There's a question of should these things be hidden from children? I think there's a particular
Mm,
passage when David, I think it then is like 10, is sort of scolded by an old woman for,
mm,
revealing something unpleasant, which actually
mm.
shows us the adult not wanting to acknowledge something. And, another question is, should things be hidden from adults? Do we hide these things for ourselves? Yeah, how much is that part of society? So, was this one of these things as part of the main theme of communication you've just described? Is it thinking about how and when we confront these darker aspects of life? Are we ever ready for them, I suppose?
Yeah, it definitely explores it. I can't say I come up with any solid answers.
Mm,
And when I
yeah.
wrote the book, I wasn't a parent, and now I am.
Mm,
I have two very small children. One is
mm,
3 and one is just turned 1. So I'm finding this every day, particularly with the 3-year-old. For
mm,
example, he is very much into insects, so he
mm,
will go looking for them, rather like David,
yeah.
and worryingly so. And he will find, dead insects. And
Mm,
it's like, how do you, on what level do you try and talk about that?
mm,
And I think for David, a lot of what happens to him throughout the novel is as a consequence of not being able to face the reality of the horror of his grandfather's death.
mm, yeah.
But there's also a level of him being affected by the fact that there is some scary things happening in the world on news reports that his parents do shield him from, and
Yeah.
he knows they're shielding him. So when they tell him a flat out truth, in it appears to be a flat out truth that his grandfather got sick very quickly and died, and yet they are hiding the reality of an outside world where people are disappearing in
Mm,
strange circumstances. This creates a strange paradox, I think, in a young
mm,
person's mind where they're not quite sure what is real and what isn't
mm,
real, and who to trust and who to
yeah.
not trust.
Yeah.
And that is the difference, I guess. I think the novel argues in a very subtle way that potentially its openness in all respects,
mm,
its consistency in openness,
mm,
that is the right approach. But that's just my opinion. I'm not
mm.
sure what the actual psychologist's opinion of this would be.
Yeah.
Um, but I find it massively interesting
Mm,
in terms of the truths that we tell young people and how it forms their character and their psyche. And I mean, I see that with my 3 year old. I mean, he's my son, but it's also like a social experiment every
mm.
day to
Yeah.
see how he's going to react to something that you've told him
Mm,
and what he is going to think about other things because of that thing you told him.
mm.
It's like a domino effect through
Yeah.
life. And
Yeah.
David himself in the novel takes this to a further degree because of his inability to talk to people as he
Mm,
gets older about his confusions and about the way he sees the world and about the truths and non-truths of his
mm,
childhood. I think communication and talking to people and feeling close to people, that you can trust them,
mm.
undoes a lot of these things. But David doesn't have that. So it's
Yeah.
a terrible path, a tricky
Mm,
path for David. And the novel follows him through to an end point where he gets
mm,
so far because of this. And I think it's quite, novel is quite surreal in some respects
mm,
and um, metaphorical, but I do think it's quite a realistic journey for a lot of
mm.
people to go down in
Yeah.
terms of the way they think as a result of
Mm.
confusions when they were young. So yeah, I can't say I've got any solid answers, but definitely got opinions on that one.
Okay. Well, let's pause our journey for now and we'll come back in part 2 and go in more depth on some of these themes. So thank you so much for discussion so far. Please do all join us for part 2, which will be available shortly, and see you then.